Hey everyone, Garth here, creator of Brushify.io. Welcome to another episode of Brushify Bootcamp. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about Procedural Grass. Brushify uses the Unreal Engine 4 Procedural Grass type system. The Grass type system is basically a set of files that let you change the meshes that spawn on the landscape and also change their scale, their density, all of that kind of good stuff. We'll also be going over how those grass type files connect to the Brushify Landscape Automaterial and how the sort of chain of connections work so that you can set up your own custom grass type files. If you like content like this, be sure to head over to www.brushify.io/bootcamp and you can check out all of the videos on that page. You can also sign up for the mailing list there. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel by hitting subscribe and hitting the little bell notification icon below. And by the way, all of the bootcamp tutorials are completely free. So let's get started and let's see if we can make some custom grass. So the first thing we're going to want to do is find a way to access the grass type files. I'm just going to jump out of the play mode here and I'm going to go up to content. And I'm going to bring up the content browser and I'm going to head straight to the Brushify folder. Inside of there, I can go to materials, landscape, grass types. Inside of the grass types folder, you'll find each of the grass types associated with the various Brushify paint layers. So you can see here beach, desert rocks, forest, grass, all of those. And if we go up to the landscape tab in the modes panel and we hit the paint tab and we come down here, we can actually see all of the different paint layers that obviously we can actually paint down. And as we actually paint each of these paint layers, I'm just going to demonstrate this. Let's paint down forest layer. And you'll be able to see that not only do I have the texture, but I also have some slightly different objects that are spawning on this this forest layer. I've got these sort of rocks and small plants and stuff, but way less grass. Whereas on the grass layer, I've got this kind of nice fluffy grass going that is completely different. And the grass type system, or the grass tool in Unreal, is the method for basically changing the meshes that spawn per paint layer. So if we go into, for instance, this forest layer, I'm just going to go LG forest, and I'm just going to bring up that grass types file. You'll actually be able to see that there's a little list here. And this list contains all of the meshes and various settings for those meshes that allow them to be placed on the terrain. So any mesh that you add to this list is going to start to spawn here on that paint layer. And the inner workings of that are already set up with the Brushify material, but we're going to go over that later and how that's exactly set up. But for now, if you just want to actually use the grass type system and tweak some stuff, maybe swap out some meshes, we're going to change the sizes. You can just do that right here in the grass types file. Everything's all set up for you with these files. So just head to Brushify, materials, landscape, grass types, and that's where you can access this. So we're going to try something now where I think I'm going to try and find a good example. We've got these sort of brownish rocks here, but you can see that there's a setting here on this brownish rock for grass density. I'm going to try increasing that to 50. I'm going to see what happens. You can see that now we've got basically 3 or 4 times as many of these brown rocks spawning. If we go even further, 150. Now we've got almost nothing but brown rocks spawning. And yeah, so this is just a case of finding parameters that you find comfortable and you think look nice, and finding things that look good aesthetically. The other big parameter here is also the scale. So you can see that we've got the scale set to 0.1 to 0.4, and that means that we've actually got a random scale between 0.1 and 0.4 happening for our assets. So if we change the maximum scale to 5, you can now see that the brown rocks are absolutely humongous. So let's change that back down to like 3. And you see they're getting smaller. 1, smaller still. And then back to what they were before, 0.4. And now they're back to a reasonable size. So by tweaking these scale parameters, you can alter the scale ranges, how the procedural assets are actually spawned. The scale can also be unlocked, so you can have a free scale, which means you could change only one scale. But then, of course, you will get these crazy stretched rocks happening because only the Z-axis is now being scaled. So you've got control over the Z, the X, Y, and Z axes there. You've also got parameters for the culling distance. So if you don't want to have your assets spawning past a certain distance, you can also control that. There's also a parameter that lets you choose how they're actually placed. Sometimes you actually want an asset to be placed in more of a grid-like pattern. So if you want, you can actually tick use grid, and then you can turn the placement jitter to 0. And I think if we upgrade the density a little bit, we should be able to see that they are forming in a more like grid-like pattern. Yeah, there we go. So you can see there are sort of grid lines forming now. And if you increase the placement jitter, they're now forming more randomly. You can also decide which is a better pattern for you. If you turn on grid and turn up the placement jitter, that might give you better results than if you disable grid entirely. So that's up to you. Just play around with that. See what works best for your procedural distribution. And so this is just one object that we've been tweaking now, the cliff slab. But you can see that in this file, all of these others, like this gray rock here. Let's see if we can find some others. Some clovers. That's these little guys. These little clovers. Those are also in the file. We've got the little flowers. Let's go crazy with the little flowers. Now there's white flowers everywhere. So you can see how the possibilities could work with this. You could really go crazy with a paint layer and have that one spawning just the flowers that you want, or having more of the detail that you want. And of course, this goes to the same with deserts, and you want on deserts you want different foliage with completely different colors spawning. You don't want to have green foliage spawning in the desert. You would want more sort of dry foliage, and so all of that sort of set up here. So if here, for instance, is the desert rocks grass type, and you can see we've got this kind of brownish rocks that are spawned instead. So yeah. And yeah, so the next thing that we're going to try and do is we're actually going to add a custom mesh to this procedural layer. I'm actually going to just go back and change that flower setting back to something reasonable. I don't want to have too many flowers. And we're going to add a new array to the list, a new element to the array, sorry. Click add element. And now you can see I've got number 9. And that's actually an empty mesh. So recently, Epic put out a bunch of free foliage packs, which I thought was really cool. So what we're going to do in this tutorial is we're going to actually bring in a custom one of the meshes from the grass library they put out. So it's Project Nature's grass library, and we're going to go into that folder, and we're going to go to meshes, grass mesh, and I'm just going to drag and drop one of those meshes in. I'm just going to set the density down a little bit so it doesn't fill it too much, but I'm going to drag and drop that into my slot. And now you can see we've got these little Project Nature grasses also spawning. Project Nature grasses also spawning on this Grasstypes layer, which is great. And now I can, of course, change the scale as well. I can maybe increase the scale of the grass. I think they look a little bit stylized, these ones, but let's see if we can make them look a bit more natural. So let's decrease the scale and see how that looks. Maybe we can try a different grass mesh, one that looks a little bit less clumpy. Maybe this one. Okay, that looks cool. And I'm going to actually add another array element. And same thing as before. I'm going to drag and drop another grass mesh. And this one's slightly different. You can see this one's got more of a... It's quite much more of a tall grass. And again, I'm going to change the scale here. So that we've got a little bit more height variation. So really, this is a great system. It just means that you can play around with different meshes that spawn on the surface here, and tweak, you know, the densities, tweak the scales, tweak the placement jitter. Always make sure with foliage that you tick random rotation and align to surface, because otherwise all of the grass will be spawned in the same rotation, and that won't look so natural. But yeah, and of course the other thing that you've got to worry about is performance. Please make sure that your any foliage that you put down or grass types that you put down are in some way optimized. So I think these ones are actually really well optimized. And you can see that as I move away from that foliage, the LODs are actually really helping them to cull away some of those extra polygons that we don't need. So yeah, just make sure that if you're picking any meshes for these lists, that they're going to be well optimized, that they're going to have LODs, that their shaders, of course, aren't going to cause too much overdraw. If we go to the overdraw here, you can see that all of the objects that I'm putting down on this procedural with the grass tool are actually showing up in the green. They're highly optimized for shader overdraw, and that's the best thing ever because we're going to be layering up so much grass. So yeah, that's how you add a new mesh to the grass tool, and how you add new meshes to Brushify's grass types. So the next thing I'm going to show you is actually how the GrassType system is connected to the Brushify Automaterial. Now this is a little bit more complicated. So, you know, if you just want the basics, you know, all of the previous part of this video is maybe all you need. However, if you're doing more complex editing, you're definitely going to want to add custom paint layers. And if you're adding custom paint layers, you'll need to learn how to add your own custom grass types. So yeah, I'm going to explain how you do that. So if you go to content, and we're going to go up to Brushify, materials, and landscape. And we're going to open the m_landscape material file. Just going to close everything down. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So it looks very complicated on the surface. I mean, this is really everything that goes into making the entire Brushify Automaterial work. So that's when you sculpt on the terrain that the texture automatically textures. If you look inside this file, there are tons of, you know, different functions and sort of texture related functions in here that are all working to make that happen. But the part that we're going to be interested in is right down at the bottom, and it's called Procedural Grass Type Enable/Disable. And if you look here, if we zoom in, you can see that there are a bunch of these sort of sample layer weight nodes. We've got grass, grass dry, desert, forest. These match up with all of the grass types. So these are just named the exact same. And these are actually the paint layers. So this is sampling a paint layer. And then I've got a node here, which is a switch parameter. And this just adds a little switch to the MI landscape material. So if we jump into the MI landscape material, scroll down, find the procedural section, and you can see that we've got enable beach pebbles, enable forest ground cover, grass, mud, rocks. So all of the paint layers or grass types are all listed here as well. And those are each of these switch parameters. And these then connect through, well, this is a mask that's being added in here. that basically takes the paint layer, and then it not only enables or decides if you're disabling it, but it puts it through a mask, and then it outputs that resulting mask onto this. This is the all-important node. This is where grass types are basically connected to the material. So inside of this grass node, this is a very important node, you can find this is all of the connected grass type files. So if you see in here, we've got all of the grass types. They're actually all specified here in the material. So if we wanted to create a new paint layer, we would actually need to add a new grass type to this list. And we would also need to set up something similar to this, where we've actually got a way of enabling and disabling the grass type inside of the material instance. And that's because not everybody always wants to have the grass types showing up all the time. You know, there are certain scenes that don't require the grass types, and you know, people always want to find a quick way to turn them off. And that's why I always include a little checkbox or a little flag in the material instance of the landscape, so you can just quickly enable and disable them. I'm just going to show that right now. So if I want to disable the forest layer, it'll take a little second to compile here, but yeah, I just unticked forest ground cover. So yeah, if I want to disable the forest layer, I just click on the landscape, go to the details panel, jump to my MI landscape material instance, scroll down, go to procedural, and disable forest ground cover. Just gonna sort my windows out a little bit so you can see this. And if I click disable on that, it's gonna do some quick little recompile. And then we're gonna be able to see that the forest ground cover is now completely disabled. Now, other grass types are still showing up, so you can see all the grass is working, but now this is completely barren. I'm just going to revert that change. And it's back again. So yeah, that's the great thing about having these little switches. So really, in order to create a new grass type for your layer, all you need to do is just copy and paste one of these basically, and add a new grass to the node list. And I'm going to do that right now. So I'm going to make a little bit of room at the bottom of the flow graph here. So I've made a little bit of space here at the bottom of the grass type section. And I'm just going to drag this down a little bit. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to switch out one of the grass types for one of our own custom ones. Now, when you create a new paint layer, you'll be able to plug in a sample from that paint layer just by copying one of these and type in the name of your paint layer. So for instance, when we created the mud layer in the previous video, we just called it mud. So if you just want to pick up the mud layer, just make sure you call it exactly the same thing as it's called in the landscape paint menu. So whatever it's called right here in this, if it's called mud, make sure you name your layer sample the exact same thing. So let's see if we can do this. We're going to go to sample mud. We're going to make a little connector. We're going to copy and paste this one. It's a little switch parameter. And we're going to call this one enable mud mud grass. And we're going to hit true. So we're going to make that connected to true. So on the mud layer, we're going to have it enabling mud grass. And then we're also going to copy and paste this little guy as well. It's a little subtract node. And you can see that all of these are connected in the exact same way. They're all connected to the same output right here. This is a very, very important output. So take that output right from the top. This is the result of the Automaterial. And you want to connect that to the subtract node. And then we're going to connect this up. And then we are going to add a new array element. We're going to call this mud grass. And the next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a custom grass type file. So I'm going to get mud, or actually I'm going to copy and paste grass or duplicate grass. I'm going to call it mud grass. And then I'm going to save that and then drag and drop it into the grass type slot here. So we've now got a new entry called mud grass, and it's connected to the grass type here. Now I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom, and I'm going to take the output of this little bit of code here, and I'm going to input that into mud grass. And now I'm going to hit save. And it's going to take a second to compile shaders. Okay, that's done. I'm just going to drag this out of the way. And we're going to paint a little bit of the mud layer. Always takes a bit of time to compile when we first paint something down. Now you can see that there's actually grass spawning on the mud layer, which is very irregular because before we didn't have any grass spawning there at all. So if I come to the MI landscape again, we can now see that we've got a new option in MI landscape. Let's just make this a bit smaller. Called mud grass, and that's currently enabled. But if I disable that, just got to recompile a few things. Now we've got our mud layer back to how it was before. So as you can see, we've actually now connected up a new grass type on the mud layer. So that's now, it's sampling the mud layer. It's got an enable and disable param so that it appears here in the material instance. It's taking the mask from Brushify, the slope mask, the remove procedural layer, all of that sort of information. And then it's outputting that information, that mask, into the grass node, which is then connected to the mud grass type, and the grass type file then stores the meshes. So this chain of nodes and files is what generates or allows the terrain or landscape to generate meshes or procedural grass types on the landscape. So just to demonstrate this, we can now go into, if we go into the material instance and enable the mud grass, we can now go into this newly created mud grass type, and we can start adding different meshes and different files to that. So I've also got the Megascans Meadow Pack. So let's try dragging and dropping a few of those Megascans assets onto there. Just going to delete some of the other grass varieties here, because we don't need so many of them. Just remove some of that stuff. And yeah, let's drag and drop the clovers from Megascans onto there. Might have to make those a little bit bigger. But yeah, you can now see that we've got these Megascans clovers that are spawning on the grass surface. Make them a little bit smaller. And yeah, the great thing about Megascan stuff, of course, is it's super detailed. So let's try adding some more stuff here. We've got, what is this, dandelions. Let's just make a new element every time. Usually I just try and set the density lower, maybe just 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. And then scale, half scale usually. Those are the sort of usual settings that work for most assets. And sometimes you have to increase the scale a bit. And now we've got this little dandelion spawning on there. So occasional dandelion spawning. Of course, you know, if you go completely mad, you can Have dandelions everywhere. And yeah, I mean, that could look actually really good for mud, you know? Sometimes you get these weeds growing out of the mud in some environments, some situations. Let's add another array element. Same thing. I'm always loading the LOD 1 because I'm not too sure if these were set up for LODs or not. And yeah, so that's how you can basically import Megascans meshes, or basically add Megascans meshes into your Grasstypes, all within the Brushify system. And yeah. One more thing to note is that you can actually remove procedural grass from the landscape by simply painting the remove procedural paint layer. So if I come into the modes panel and then landscape paint, and I scroll right down to the bottom of the paint layers, you can see this little paint layer here, remove procedural. And when I paint that down, it takes a little bit of a second to compile. But when I actually paint that down, you can see it starts to chip away or kind of remove any of the foliage. So I can actually use this to remove procedural foliage from the terrain. And of course I can make my brush size a little bit bigger and then, you know, completely remove all the foliage in an area. And I could even remove the foliage from the entire map. And then of course I can shift click to add the foliage back in. So click to remove, shift click to put it back. And yeah, this is a really great way to clear out foliage from your scene. One thing to note is that this actually uses a no weight blend layer info. So when you're creating a layer info, make sure that you click no weight blended layer as opposed to a weight blended layer, because that will, the weight blended layer will actually paint down black on the terrain. So if you get that problem that you're painting down black when you paint the remove procedural layer, that's because you've selected a weight blended layer rather than a no weight blended layer. But yeah, other than that, make sure you choose no weight blend and then you're pretty much good to go. And you can start painting down, removing foliage just by painting down this layer. Let me know if you guys found this video useful, and please subscribe to the channel if you are interested in more tutorials like this. Cheers, guys.